Okay, time is 5:01. We'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. We'll begin with the pledge of allegiance. Please stand with me for that. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
A nice cadence and nice work. You saw somebody's off a little bit.
Practice.
You're school.
Well, it's good to see everybody here tonight. It's always nice to have a full room. We'll go ahead and start with our public comment session. Please limit your comments to 3 meetings. Also, please state your name and where you live for the record. Is there any public comment in the room?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Pat Barker. I live a couple miles out of town. I'm a farmer and I'm here to voice I don't think you should sell the railroad. And my reasoning is that with the current political climate, we could very well lose the dams. And I don't think that infrastructure would ever come back, was ever taken out or somebody decided to do away with it. So that option should, I hope, stay on the table.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else in the room have a public comment?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I'm Chuck Ketterman. I live at 100 Hogeye Hollow Road, just out of town a little ways. And I'm interested in what's motivating this sale? Is there, you've had a lot of contacts with the county patrons here and they've told you they want to sell the railroad? Or, I guess what got this started? You can answer that, or maybe answer it during the meeting. Maybe there'll be some other people have the same question. You're obviously serious about selling it because you spent what, $40,000 on an appraisal, or $40,000 plus dollars. So that tells me you've done some thinking about it anyway. And I was curious if your executive director is recommending you do this. Again, that's a yes or a no answer, I guess. It's my understanding that the current leasee is interested in purchasing the railroad with the idea of storing old railroad cars on it. And that's will generate income to that individual. I'm not sure what they pay per car rent, but it would seem to me that as opposed to selling the railroad to someone so they could store cars, why couldn't the port do that? That seems like an income situation. I agree with Pat that there's a possibility that the tribes will prevail someday down the road and we'll lose those dams. And in that case, this railroad would be invaluable as a link to the Columbia. So the whole thing has kind of a bad smell to me. I'm not understanding exactly, again, what's motivating this. Is it some kind of an agenda, some way to sabotage the port? We want to do what's best for the county.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and respond to a couple of things that you mentioned. What started this is we were approached by the operator of the railroad if we would be interested in selling it. And since then we have been doing, well, this was a couple of years ago. Since then, we've been doing research and looking into the options and the pros and the cons and, what really would be entailed with it and, looking at all aspects of it. Is it a good idea? We don't know yet. We're not convinced either way. The reason we would, or the interest that I would personally, if I was to want to sell the railroad, is for the preservation of the line, to continue the service of it. It needs a lot of work, a lot of money put into it, and we don't really have the funds available to do that right now. The grants are really difficult, especially federal grants for railroads are extremely difficult to get. So we don't have a lot of money to put into it. The railroad operator said that he's interested in maintaining it, improving it, bringing more traffic to it, and basically doing more business with it. But he's not interested in doing that. He doesn't have ownership of it if he's just renting it. So those are some of the background as to what we're doing. We spent 9 months going through our comprehensive plan. Talking about the different options and what's involved in that. So no decisions made at this time. We're simply trying to see what is going to be the best for the county, for the port, for the constituents. I have been approached by many people in the county saying it would be a good idea to sell it to them so that he can improve it. If he wants to put rail cars or rail cars on it, he can do that now. He has the entire line leased. So if he wants to do that, there's nothing stopping him, whether he leases it or owns it. He has the line lease, he gets to do with it what use goes for it. So that doesn't really make a difference. If we were going to, as a port, store cars on it, I guess we'd have to, amend the lease to where we're using part of it. He doesn't have the rights to do that because right now he's leasing the entire line. So, yeah, I guess we're going to see how things progress with it and which way we decide to go, but we're not making a rash decision and not taking this half-heartedly or lightly. We really want to do what's best to maintain the preservation of the railroad and keep it operational for years to come. In case, like what you say, the dams do go away, we need to make sure that there's a viable, usable line there. There have been commissioners in the past that have talked about scrapping the line, taking the tracks off of it and just turning it into recreational and not having any railroad use on it at all. And that frightens me. That was just a simple thing to commission that the vote could be just to scrap it. And if it was in the hands of the private sector, then that wouldn't be on the table. It'd have a better chance of longevity, in my opinion, if the port didn't own it. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. We'll see how things go. Thank you.
Am I too late?
Yeah.
I'd like to make the same comment I made at the last meeting. First, let me, Jerry Kaiser, 117 South 8th Street, Dayton. Last month, I asked you commissioners to put a motion on the floor to direct the executive director and staff to start filing for grants, and there was no motion put on the floor, of course, but I would still like to see a motion on the floor so that the staff can go have the, empower the staff to go after the federal grants. There's been grants granted all over the state of Washington. Food rails last month alone, 115 million federal dollars were granted to 9 different municipalities here in the state of Washington. And we saw none of it. And it's because we're not filing for the grants.
So she doesn't need a motion to be able to do that. That's part of her everyday job is to be looking for grant opportunities.
We're
For that.
looking for direction from the
The
commission.
directive for doing that is in the minutes from last month's meeting. So if you'd like to review those, they're available. So there has been directive to start looking into that. So we're working in that direction. Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Chris Sharps, plant manager for Seneca Foods. I'm relatively ambivalent as to who owns the track, but Seneca Foods wants to see it stay open. We put on 65 to 85 boxcars a year. It saves us a lot of money in trucking expense. I do think that whoever owns it, particularly somebody like CWW, will have a vested interest in keeping it open because they make some money at it. But at this point, I think the port has done an admirable job of getting it to this point, getting grants, because we got some grants before. CWW has been a much better track operator than the previous track operators, so I have faith in CWW. But I also have faith that regardless of how it goes, it can stay open for a little while longer. It needs to stay open for our business. We're not gonna fold if it doesn't, we have options, but I think for what we do in this part of the county, it's pretty important.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else in the room? Go ahead.
Yes, David McKinley, 105 Acre Road. I'm a farmer in Columbia County. I'm sure that the commissioners know what the mission statement is for the Port of Columbia. But I just wanted to read it for everybody else that's here. The Port of Columbia has a mission to maximize public resources and private investment to create jobs, provide infrastructure, and maintain and improve the economic vitality of the county. And I think that selling the railroad would be a direct conflict with the mission statement of this board. So I'm asking you three gentlemen to be careful and, think about what's best for our community. And I hope that there are no private or personal agendas involved in this. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else in the room?
I guess I'm going to add to that.
Yes,
So, hear the concerns, looking forward to more conversations. I'm glad you're here having those conversations. I'm also looking for, are we going out and looking for some more conversations on this with all kinds of folks? Yeah, there is no agenda other than what's best for Columbia County. That is my agenda. So I want that thing to, it was way before me when it got installed, and hopefully it's here way after me. That's the mission that I have in how I'm looking at it. And there's a lot of information, and be able to make a decision, I need all the information. So that all this is an information gathering. And then we'll go from there and have some more conversation with the community and hopefully come up with a consensus and see this thing where it needs to be. So that's kind of to answer your question on the why for me, and the agenda, and to cover some. I too am a little worried about transportation, the dams, the barging, and I think it's super valuable to have that railroad here and to put another one in. That ain't ever gonna happen. So keeping that thing alive and functional, not just there, but functional, where we can use it more than we're using it right now. That's kind of where my head's at with it. So to answer some of those questions.
Could I ask, if you were to sell it, how would you keep that individual from deciding I need some funds here and scrap it out?
Well, that's where we would turn to our legal experts and say, what avenues are there? What avenues that we can to protect our community for that? I don't have the answer to that yet, but that would be something we would absolutely look into and say, how do we secure that? How do we make sure that that goes forward legally? What are the options before we weigh anything else? But that's some of the steps in it, yeah, for sure.
With the grant process, I'm under the, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought that ports had access to a lot more grants than private companies. So I'm pretty much thinking that you would have access to more money than a private person that owned it.
there's a lot of grants available for the private sector. Including the federal grants. There's many of the grants that we can apply for, they can apply for as well. There are some that are only open to government entities, but the majority, there's many grants are available for private or for public operations. Again, the goal for me is to have this railroad having the most viable and its best chance of operating. I do not believe that the port is making the best and highest use of that property right now, because we can't afford to get it to the way it needs to be. There could be a lot more traffic on that. There could be a lot more freight traffic. There could be passenger traffic for tourism events. And these are things that, I'm interested in seeing happen on there. And these are things that I don't see anytime in the near future us being able to accomplish with what we have going on right now. I see a better opportunity for the operator to be able to succeed in that avenue and making success out of what the line is and making it better and improving upon it and bringing more traffic to it. I feel that is the best option at this time. But we still have to hear what the appraisal says, and we've got to gather more information. So we'll see how things go as it progresses. Go ahead, Mike.
So I want an operational railroad. I would love to see tourist trains come up here doing that. It costs money. there are grants available, but from what I know, our operator didn't even apply for grants until he was asked whether he was applying for grant. So I'm worried that our operator is looking at devaluing our railroad so he can get the best price out of it. Sorry, that's my feelings. And I think that the port is, just like the county is for county roads, we can be the point that is driving our railroad to get better and better. I believe that if we sell the railroad, it could be scrapped, it could be sold. I don't know that there's a way to protect us from them making a profit, just like you said. He's renting it, he can stack cars up here right now if he wanted to. Right now, he's making more money with Seneca and storing few cars on the sidings at Huntsville and out at Poles. Anyway, so there are cars being stored. I don't know how many, and it doesn't really matter. But we could, other ports are operating their railroads for profit. We could actually make income for the port to do better things if we so decided. But it takes some decision. If we're in the mode to sell, be the best stewards of the whole line, why isn't the operator suing to get access down the Walla of ports to take grain all the way down there? Well, I mean, it's a big challenge to sue who is it that operates the main line? UP. It'd take a big challenge to get access there, but they owned it. They gifted it to our county years ago. Why are they now denying access to get grain down? Why aren't we suing for access? We own part of the line that should have access to the main line to haul grain clear to Portland. And we haven't taken affirmative action to say, why aren't we being granted access down there either? So are we failing not to help get access onto the main line to get grain down to the port? Just saying, I want an operating railroad. If we could guarantee that without ownership, I'd be all in favor of it. But I want to guarantee that we don't lose the railroad from here all the way down to the Columbia.
I don't see you getting a guarantee with that, no matter what, no matter who owns it. I mean, commissions change. Any other comments in the room? Going to Zoom, any public comments on Zoom? Okay, let's get into our administrative items. Have commissioners had an opportunity to review last month's minutes from November 13th?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll move to approve the minutes of the last meeting.
I will second that motion for the November 13th, 2024 minutes.
We have a motion and a second to approve the November 13th minutes. Those in favor respond by saying aye.
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 Minutes are approved. Moving on to our reviewing the monthly budget report and approving of vouchers.
Okay, so you have your budget report in your packet. This is year end, but this is not a complete budget report because we will still continue to receive rent through the end of December. So that is not complete. And we don't receive our tax report from the county until January. So we always have to give you a true year end report in January. But so far for the year, we have taken in $59,716 more than we spent. So we're on the right side of the red line. Taken in, quite a bit more revenue than we projected, most of it with the fiber leases. The commercial kitchen at Blue Mountain Station has been very busy. We've taken in way more there than we expected. And then on the expense side, of course, you know how those categories go. Some of them are over, some of them are under, but the bottom line is that we are under about quite a bit under, on expenses compared to what we budgeted, so generally in good shape.
Perfect.
So unless you have questions on the voucher sheet, don't think there was anything too odd, really. We paid Anderson Perry for a little bit more work on the SEPA for the, craft malt project. Petrichor is our revenue share, our monthly revenue share for the fiber leases. Red Band Cellars was, supplies for our Christmas trays that we do for the tenants. RL Banks is the rail appraisal. Sensky is the Christmas lights. And the Q was the food for our SEDS meeting. So those are the really only unusual expenditures. And I'm happy to answer questions if you have any.
Any questions? Mr. Commissioners?
I don't have any.
None from me. Hey, do we have any leases this month?
We just have one lease this month, and that is with Ray Studio. They are a renter in the co-working space. And so this is I have nothing in front of me, Tracy. This is how many year?
It's a 1 year.
1 year lease.
Sorry.
Yeah, okay. 1 year lease at the co-working.
And no rate.
No rate increase because we increased hers last year.
Yep. Sorry. Should have given that to you.
I'm gonna count on Tracy to have my lease stuff in front of me.
Okay, we have our 2025 meeting schedule in front of us. Doesn't look like anything particularly unusual about that from previous
Nothing,
years.
nope, we did the same thing we've done in the past with the changing the date in July, June at the marina, and July, moving it up a
Right.
week because of that conference.
So we need a motion to approve this, guys, if you're comfortable with it.
Yeah, I will not be here on the eighth, so I will be via Zoom.
In January,
Oh, yeah, eighth of January.
Okay.
Business, 10 on. I know that one for sure. So I make a motion to approve the 2025 schedule, board meeting schedule as written.
Second,
Okay, motion and second to approve the 2025 Port Commission meeting schedule. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Schedule is approved. So let's go ahead and go to update on port assets, beginning with CWW Railroad.
okay, so before we get into the presentation, I will, Keith, I'll go ahead and do the share screen so you can share and you can start on that while I talk. We did get, speaking of grants, I guess maybe I don't talk about this stuff enough, but we did get a $1.69 million grant to upgrade the crossing and the equipment at the Bowles Junction crossing on Highway 124. So I'm meeting with DOT, the UTC, Columbia Rail, next Monday for actual site visit, and then they'll start the process of getting that done. So I think I told you that already, but I want to make sure everybody knew that. We have gotten many grants over the years to put into the rail line. It's just, as you know, to make it passenger worthy would be, 20 million or something, and I don't know that that's gonna happen anytime soon, or if that's also you have to, there's argument on whether or not that would be profitable, but okay, so we'll go into our presentation. So I'm going to introduce, it's kind of hard to see here on Zoom, unfortunately, but we have contracted with two firms to produce this railroad appraisal. One firm is RL Banks and Associates, and the other is Gary R. Engelmeyer and Associates. RL Banks deals with the track side of the appraisal. They're more the railroad experts. And Gary's firm is the underlying real estate, because this is set 37 miles of railroad and much of it is 100-foot right of way. So that's a lot of property. And so today we have, you can go ahead and go to the next screen if you want to, Keith. I think, didn't you guys have who you were on or maybe it was the next screen. So we have Charles Banks with us today. He is the president of RL Banks and Associates. And we have Keith Bruno, who is the director of development, and I didn't write it down, development and planning, something like that. Sorry, Keith. And then we have Gary from Gary R. Engelmeyer and Associates. And so each of the three of them will be making a presentation. There are different approaches to determining the value of a rail line, whether it's still a rail line, whether you take the track out, there's various methodologies. So these three guys will go through it. I did want to make one clarification though, before we move forward. There is nothing keeping this line as it is right now from having more business on it. They are hauling cars from Seneca all the way to the end of the line. It is a usable line. It's almost like I'm getting the impression that people think we have to take action or it's going to fall apart, and that is simply not the case. It is an operating rail line. So let's make sure everybody knows that. Okay, so Keith, I guess I turn it over to you. You're first. Is that correct? Or is it Charles? I can't remember.
Nope, that's correct. Thank you very much. I'm Keith Bruno with RL Banks and Associates. And just to provide a quick background on the project itself, we were engaged by the port to perform the valuations on the track itself, the underlying real estate, as well as a feasibility study. So what we did was break down the project into three separate tasks. The net liquidation value of the track assets based on a physical inspection. We had a team member travel to the geographical area and perform a physical inspection of the line. Also, task 2 was the appraisal of the real estate, is where Mr. Angermile comes into the picture. And then task 3 was a preliminary rail feasibility analysis of the line in its current state. And just a brief background on RL Banks and Associates. We are a multidisciplinary consulting firm, and we provide expertise in exclusively the rail space with clients of large railroads such as the UP and the BNSF out on the West Coast, and smaller railroads, short lines that are peppered throughout the country. We have over 60 years of experience providing the economic analytical services on both private sector and public sector projects. So we're well versed in public sector projects such as this. And also as Jenny mentioned, we teamed up with Gary Engelmeyer and his firm to conduct the real estate appraisals of the parcels. Our team on this project, Mr. Banks, our president, who's with us this evening, joined in 1985, and he's focused on railroad negotiations, strategic planning, and economics of financing the acquisition, expansion, and rehabilitation of numerous railroads. We like to say we're in the business of railroading. Keith Bruno, that's me. I'm the Director, System Planning and Development. My quick background, I came from a large railroad on the East Coast, the Class 1 CSX, and also worked on short line railroads. So I'm very well versed in how those relationships work and are structured. And then also on the private side, experience with both railroads, big and small, as a shipper. Gary, who's also with us this evening, is our real estate appraisal partner with over 34 years in real estate valuation services that specifically in the railroad sector. Mr. Don Bagley, who's not with us tonight, he is our Senior Associate of Transportation Engineering. He has numerous decades with the engineering departments on Norfolk Southern and their predecessors, as well as CSX Transportation, who are the two big railroads on our side of the Mississippi. With that as our brief bio background, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Keith, and good afternoon or good evening, folks. I hope you can hear me. I hope you can see me decently, but it's more important to see this slide. I'm sorry this slide is so complicated, but I think it is the best way to get across a relatively complicated point. There are two primary points I want to make. The first is that let me back up for a second. As immodest as it sounds, I am a railroad valuation expert, probably one of the leading experts in the country. And I say that because I've been involved I've been doing this for 35 years plus as a consultant, but I've spent my entire life in the railroad industry. I'm 72. I started when I was 18. I've never gotten a paycheck from an organization that wasn't related to the railroad space. The point of this slide, the first major point I want to make is that there are three ways to value any business, not just a railroad business. And they're all shown on this same page, and that's what makes it so busy. But I think it's better to look this way, have it all on one, because otherwise you'd be going back and forth between the pages, or I would. Starting on the left, there's what I'm calling the stock market approach or business value. And we'll come back to the details of it in a second. In the middle, I have something called the cost approach, which is coming up with the value of a company based on the sum, SUM, of the value of the assets that constitute that business. And over on the right is something called income approach or going concern value. All three of them are legitimate. Good arguments can be made for one or the other, and I'll go through those in a moment. But the most important issue is that, generally speaking, the approach which yields the highest value is the value to which any seller is entitled. And again, this has nothing to do specifically with your situation or railroads in general. This is true of any business. I have an MBA from the Wharton School, which many people consider one of the top business schools in the country. I took a lot of finance courses, and this is what I learned. Going to the left, the stock market approach is generally considered by academics the best way to value an enterprise. And the way, just very simply here, working down that first column, basically you take the number of shares that have been issued, you multiply it by the price per share, and that gives you the total value of the shares. You then subtract the debt that the company has outstanding, and that gives you an enterprise value. That's the first, and academics say by far the best way to value a company. Why? Because the NASDAQ stock exchange has by far the simplest requirements, the easiest to meet. They require 400 separate shareholders for a stock to be listed. And academics feel that if 400 people are arguing over what the price of a share should be, that's a very good marketplace. And that is why people tend to say that that's the best way to value a company. However, this railroad is not listed on a stock exchange, nor are most short line railroads. So unfortunately, that's not available to us. Okay, that's the first. So our work, and what you're about to hear from my technical experts here, is really the centerpiece of our approach and also the center part of this slide. It's the cost approach. and I know this is complicated and I expect you to ask questions, but we would ask that you hold on, not ask any questions until we're done with the presentation. We'll be happy to pull these slides back up. So the first thing to understand is that there are really two types of assets here, and you see those depicted in red. There's the track on the left of the center, and there's the real estate on the right of the center. Mr. Bruno will talk about the track. Mr. Engelmeyer will talk about the real estate. Okay? But the other dimension that you need to think about is that in many situations, there's a difference between what it costs if you liquidate something and what it costs if you have to buy it or build it new. And that's what is above and below both the columns labeled track and real estate. And so in the case of real estate, well, I'll start with track because we're going to talk about that first. We have come up with a net liquidation value. That's in the bottom left square. That is what Mr. Bruno will be explaining momentarily. And that is how much the port, we estimate the port would likely yield if it did, in fact, liquidate the track. If no more track was available, how much could they net by liquidating the track? And that'll give you a figure. And we will give you these figures, but I want you to first think about the methods and conceptually what I'm talking about, because I know once I give you the numbers, you will be focused completely on the numbers. But the numbers are useless without the context of the numbers. So I'm going to drag you through this. I hope you'll be patient with me. So there's a net liquidation value of the track on the bottom left. There's a net liquidation value of the real estate on the bottom right. And we're going to give you both those figures. On the upper right, we're also going to give you something called a corridor or assembly value, which is different than the net liquidated value. On the upper left, you see in that square something called reproduction costs new less depreciation, which we've shortened to the initial letters RCNLD. That is a legitimate way to do such work. We recently did it for the city of Charlotte, North Carolina, which wants to buy a rail line from a major railroad. It's in the process of doing it. They hired us to come up with the RCNLD of that rail line. We did not calculate that number because of budget constraints. We are capable of calculating it, and if so directed, we will calculate it. But just so you understand, that one square we haven't calculated, the others we have. Big picture here, this is the cost approach. We're trying to figure out what you would yield on the bottom row there, both left and right, in the event the railroad were liquidated, and in the upper right, how much it would be worth essentially, how much it would cost, hence cost approach, if you had to assemble the right-of-way from scratch today. Okay, that's not the same thing as net liquidation value. Mr. Engelmeyer will explain why. We have not done the upper left. So that's the cost approach. Until you ask me questions, I'm sitting with that. Now, there is also something called the income approach, which some people refer to as a going concern value. And I'm not going into all the detail here because it would take too much time. But essentially, you forecast expected annual revenues and you subtract from that figure expected annual costs by year. And that gives you expected annual cash flows, which I've then depicted on the bottom half of the right column. So you can see year one and it's got a number, year two, it's got a number underneath, 3, 4, and 5, they don't have to be the same. And then you multiply it, you discount it. These are discounted cash flows to get a net present value for each of those years. And then when you sum up the net present values, you end up with a number. If you ask me in advance which one is better, the cost approach or the income approach, my answer, whether you asked it in this context or anybody else asked me in any other context, would be whichever yields the higher number, the income approach or the cost approach, that is what a seller is entitled to. However, the executive director and I spoke before we were contracted with you all. And she and I thought that the greatest likelihood was that the cost approach would actually yield a higher number than the income approach. And given budget constraints, we were not commissioned to develop an income approach. So the left column, even though I detailed it in the interest of completeness, and the right column are not really available at this time and in our presentation. We spent just enough time and effort to look at a preliminary income approach or feasibility, and reached the conclusion that our initial instincts were correct and that the value of the assets or the cost approach is what we should be moving forward with, which is what we did. I'm ready for the next slide. Keith, should I take this one? I think we decided I would speak to this. Yes? Okay. So here are the results. Thank you for your attention so far. We have 4 numbers up top, beginning with 2 million. They're not expected to be in any particular order. And you see 2 million, 5 million below that, 2.5 million below that, and 8.4 million below that. Those are 4 component pieces. The first 2 have to do with the track. The second 2 have to do with the real estate. You see those words in the first 4 rows on the left side under item. What is the difference? So the first one assumes that the track is removed. It costs a lot of money to actually take the track up in order to load it into rail cars and move the rail wherever, or the ties or the other track material to wherever would fetch the highest price. So that is a net liquidation value, net of the expenses. And that is why that number is so much less than the number above it. Sort of the same kind of thing applies in the real estate lines 3 and 4. I'll let Mr. Engelmeyer go into more detail because he's better qualified to do so. But the third number there is a net liquidation value. So it's the lowest number that we believe is reasonable. And the next one is a corridor value, which starts in the same place that the number above it starts, but ends in a higher place. I don't want to go into more detail than that. But then we will revisit the slide at the end. But the point I want to make is that the last 4 lines are 4 different scenarios, if you will, which are different combinations of the numbers above. And they range anywhere from 5.367 million to 13.724. I think that's enough to whet your appetites. And I think it's my turn to pass it back to, I think, Keith.
Correct. Thank you, Charlie. And with the net liquidation value of the track, I'm going to explain some of the methodology behind it. We adhered to the gross liquidation value, which the GLV is essentially that. What is all the track and material worth as it is where it is? The next layer of that calculation is to estimate the liquidation expenses. Then that would be the physical removal of the materials. They'll need to be deconstructed, sorted, stacked, staged, and activities such as that. So there is an expense behind collecting the materials, if you will. And then that's what the track salvage value would be. It's the removal and restoration, rendering the assets to be saleable to other railroads to relay, as we call it, relay the track on their property, or scrap value into the steel market or the tie chipping market. And to drill that down even further, that calculation also incorporates the administrative and marketing transportation expenses. So that would be any fees associated with brokerage, a tie dealer, a rail dealer, as well as their marketing efforts, and also the transportation expenses. Once, presuming that this is not an FOB or as is, where is, when sold, we also calculated the transportation expenses to ship by rail to a, not knowing where the potential buyers would be, a centralized location. In this instance, we used Chicago, Illinois, is equidistant depending on a potential buyer. They may be closer, they may be further. And then once you debit out or subtract out all the expenses behind repurposing the track materials and track, is how you arrive at your net liquidated value. And this table is to illustrate the costs in this project behind all those efforts. So our gross, we started off at 5.326 million is the gross value, as is, where is, with the track in place. So that's why you'll note in the very bottom line, it is an identical number. What we're looking at here is these top 4 sections are the components to arrive at these 2 scenarios at the bottom. So here in the negative, we debited out our liquidation expenses of 1.075 million, and then the cost of the administrative, marketing, and transportation at almost 1.4 million. So to arrive at the net liquidation value, if the track were to be removed, the value, the proceeds left over would be the 2.857 million. Without taking on the expense of the transportation and removing the track, if it were to stay in place, you would essentially not incur the transportation expenses, thus netting the higher value, leaving it in place at the 5.326 million. With that, I will pass it to Mr. Gary Angermeyer to go through our calculations on the real estate appraisal.
All right, good evening. Charlie summed it up a little bit there, but I did the real estate valuation component of this, and there are two ways to look at valuing the real estate of the right-of-way in a broad picture. You can get into a lot of details, but I'm trying to keep it very high level here. A lot goes into this, but I don't want to, provide too much, get too drilled down too much into the weeds here. But so you're going to see a pretty wide extreme on how these numbers can be different, and there's pretty good reason on why they're different. But I have prepared this quarter value and net liquidation value. Both of them start off with what's called the across the fence value. And we can just quickly go to the next slide here, Keith. You see a picture of a railroad right away, and my job is to go through and determine which side is the highest best use of that, and apply that land value to the corridor. So every time that land use changes, we estimate what the land is worth and apply it to the land area of the corridor. In your case, most of it's pretty rural agricultural land. And if you get into a city, there's some industrial land, could be some residential. But most of the land in this case was agricultural, rural acreage. So this across the fence value is a starting point for both of those methodologies in valuing the corridor real estate. And in this, it's the basis for both of those. So in this case, we estimated that across the fence value, ATF, we call it the ATF value, so the value of that land located adjacent to the corridor, just applied to the court area is $7 million. And then that is the basis that goes into the next two methodologies of looking at them. And first we'll look at the net liquidation value. So Keith, if you can just go to the next slide. And the net liquidation value, the big difference between the two of these is one values it as if the highest best use is not for rail and it's going to be sold off on a piecemeal basis over a period of years. That across the fence value has to be discounted to induce a sale because it's very atypical. Once it's not for rail, because it's a long, narrow strip of land, it's not conducive for a lot of conventional real estate uses. So it's generally not marketable when you're selling these off. They're like uneconomic remnants. So there's that across the fence value is discounted, and then it has to get put into a sell-off schedule over a number of years to sell it off, and you'll have expenses. So kind of like that going concern income approach, somewhat of an income approach, because you're plugging in this forecast of selling it all off, and you have to discount it pretty heavily. It's not a typical kind of a real estate project, and what you end up with is the net liquidation value. It's the net present value of the sum of all those proceeds. So that's the net liquidation value. Before we get to that, I just want to point out it's really not a market value. That net liquidation value is it's originated with the Surface Transportation Board, and it was to how you value failed railroad companies. And they're very strict guidelines on how you value how you have to value. It's very, very legally prescribed in these guidelines and how you do it. It's not typically how the market values these. It represents the lowest threshold of value. Some would call it the blood in the streets kind of number. It's kind of dump it all, get whatever you can for it kind of number. So you're saying that's the absolute low end of the what the real estate would be worth if it were sold off, not to be used as rail on that premise. So now if we go back to what we call the corridor value, we start with that same across the fence value. And in this case, there's no adjustments to it because in this case, you're saying the highest best use is as a corridor. So you take that across the fence value and you don't adjust for the narrow shape, because you're not selling it off for an alternate use. You're saying the highest best use is as a corridor, and there's generally a premium to that, or for an assemblage premium, because if the highest best use is as a corridor, then there's value to that assembled right away. It connects points A and B and points in between. And that's generally what's used to estimate the market value of a corridor. And the way we do that is we take the sale of when a railroad corridor sells, you take that sell price divided by, if you can get it, a lot of cases I've estimated these myself, what that across the fence value was, and it's called a corridor factor. And you analyze those sales, you try to do the best you can. These things are all over the place, but you try to match a large line, a more rural. That's a real important distinction. Is it a rural line, suburban, urban? And they have different factors. Obviously, if you're, the more desirable the corridor is, the higher that factor is, and the less desirable the corridor is, the less demand there is for it, the lower it is. I mean, illustratively, the Northeast corridor, a very highly active rail line with huge amounts of demand would sell for a very high premium to that, high factor, versus something in the middle of nowhere with no shipping. It has no use even as a trail. just a real problematic line would sell at the lower end of that. And in this case, I analyzed sales of quarters, and given the characteristics of this line, I applied a 1.2 corridor factor to that $7 million across the fence value. And I do think the highest, the best use is as a corridor. And so that's a more relevant number for this line, given future. I don't get into the rail operations at all, but there could be some pretty large potential in the future for business on this line. So 1.2 is kind of a lower end of the range, or most are in a 1.25 to 1.5. So not a really high quarter factor. And that's how you get this huge spread, this 2.5 million versus 8 million for it. And they can even get wider than that. But you can see some pretty wide spreads depending on how people look at these. As far as the sell-off, it rarely actually happens with the net liquidation value. These quarters are almost always preserved, no matter what. In fact, I think Charlie could apply this more with surface transportation, but I think you'd have to get you would have to file for abandonment to sell it, and they really try to preserve these. They're very difficult to get into place, and once they're there, they're rarely ever disassembled and sold off like that. So it's more of a hypothetical exercise. But I get the easy part. I get to put the numbers on here. You guys get to all fight over where you go from there. But anyway, I guess that's pretty much. You can get in a lot of detail of this. Anybody wants to ask me questions about it, we can ask later. But that's the big picture on that. I guess we can move on to whatever the next.
Yep. All right. Thank you, Gary. I take the mic from you.
Sure.
Thank you, Gary. Next up is the preliminary rail feasibility analysis that we performed. The purpose was to identify any potential profitability as a freight railroad, and also to shed some light on other likelihood of this combination of assets could generate revenue by the Port of Columbia. So essentially, we looked at three different sectors, if you will, avenues. Number one, the carload volumes, rail car storage, and then also the physical characteristics of the corridor and how those would come into play regarding the feasibility of a rail line. Carloads, for those that aren't aware, that's the typical way railroads generate revenue with the shipments of loaded cars and returning the empties. It's just the straight up transportation of the freight via rail. Currently, on the portion, the Columbia to Walla Walla, it doesn't have a significant number of customers compared to other short lines of similar length and footprint, relatively speaking. And the customers currently do not generate a significant number of car loads, which kind of creates a metric measure of traffic density that's airs to the lower side in comparison to other railroads, short line railroads similar in size. That's not to say that some car loads may have more value. Some short line railroads may handle a lower carload volume, but they may be higher margins due to the commodity and any specialized handling. So given that the railroad currently doesn't enjoy your traditional railroad revenue streams, makes it a little more challenging. But then with the short lines, they do have the ability to enjoy other, what I'll call ancillary business streams. And in this case, and in other operations, rail car storage. Rail car storage is a lucrative business. There's really no set standardization or regulations on this as far as rates per car or what are called switching fees when a rail car is stored. It is a little difficult to forecast in some instances because rail car owners like to keep their rail cars moving and generating revenue for them. However, if there's any hiccups, whether it be planned seasonality, as with the grain market, we're in the busy season. And auto racks are another good example of the seasonality when the big car rental companies do their buying in January and February, and auto racks are hard to come by. But then come the summer months, when transportation needs are down, car owners have to find places to store their cars that won't hinder the fluidity of any other rail network. And that's where short line railroads really meet the need of this almost a niche market within the rail industry. Most of the times it would be either a vacant yard or a passing siding where it isn't needed to keep, if there's no opposing trains, well, if the operations can afford to essentially take a siding out of service, its useful service of meeting and passing trains, and capitalize on that track space to generate a revenue by parking idle cars. So at the kind of in summation, on this line, there's a lot of pros and a few cons. I'll brief you on briefly. One of the bigger pros is that this line, if maintained in a rail facet, has connections to both Union Pacific and BNSF, which are the two largest railroads, definitely west of the Mississippi, and if not, speaking as our nation's rail network as a whole. What that means is that it can increase a shipper's reach, because BNSF goes into places that UP doesn't, and vice versa. And in some cases, which it's referred to as dual served. So a shipper on this line may have a customer, just to pick a random state, let's just say Nevada, that is also dual served. Well, that is a unique opportunity for someone who would like to establish a business or industry within this line, because it's very rare that you can, I wouldn't say pit two railroads together, but you can call each one and negotiate rates and then create some competitiveness between two large railroads, which is very rare and very unique and very favorable in this situation. It also provides the rail option. I know somebody had mentioned previously about the barging and the river, and if the rail option was to dry up, no pun intended, and then something happened with the barge, that would equate to a lot of trucks in the local community, and that would probably be more of a public concern over noise, traffic, congestion, if any industry were to be established and trucking was the only mode available to them. It would be a much different public opinion. And lastly, on the pros, as Gary mentioned in his reports, this is largely the land use is largely agricultural. Not trying to detract from the agricultural business, but that is more conducive to few acres to establish an industry that has the option to ship by rail, as opposed to trying to start let's just say a tire factory or something that's in close proximity to dense population centers. So being that this corridor is predominantly agriculture, that in the future, that could be a very positive to corporations looking to invest and expand in the local area. Few of the cons, that it is a stub end, meaning it is a dead end line. So there would be some operational conundrums. Any traffic that comes in has to come back out the same way it came in. If there was large volumes of traffic to move, that could potentially play a role in some of the transit times in the future with future growth. And given the current carload volumes, they're very low in comparison. So to offset the cost of maintaining and operating the railroad as a railroad business would require a significant amount of grants and grant funding to sustain it. We did analyze also the current car storage capacity. I understand that, with the seasonality or the traffic volumes, the current operator can afford the luxury of surrendering mainline tracks to the storage business, but not being briefed on the day-to-day operations. Some of those calculations and reviewed based on rail siding capacities on the presumption that fluid north-south, if you will, traffic is to be maintained and car storage wouldn't impede the day-to-day operations, because if you have to keep moving rail cars in and out of your way, there's a cost behind that, and that's just going to erode your profits from the storage. So our presumption was that the siding capacity is the limiting factor on car counts to be stored. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny. We replicated this table, but I'll turn it back over to Jenny and open up the question and answer segment. And we presume we'd be entertaining most of the Q&A based on this slide. So it is a replicated slide as we transition.
You have to go. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I guess it's time for questions and answers. I actually have a question, if I may start, if that's okay with you. Gary, you said, you talked about the Surface Transportation Board monitoring closely the abandonment of rail lines, and you said it's rare. We are surrounded in our area by abandoned rail lines. I mean, this rail line didn't used to be a stub line. I rode the train on this line from here to Pomeroy when I was a kid. So is that something newer that the STB is doing? Not allowing lines to be abandoned?
Well, I'm not really an expert on STB, Surface Transportation Board procedures that they do. Charlie might be able to answer that better, but my understanding over the years I've been doing these is that they try everything they can to not have them get abandoned. I mean, their purpose is, I think, to preserve these corridors and keep them active and not abandoned. That's just been my general experience, but I wasn't aware that there were so many abandoned quarters in your area, and a lot of that may have happened in the 70s, but it's done. I mean, a lot of that that consolidation, there was a huge amount of that, which predated, when I got into doing these. But back then there was a lot of activity with the consolidation in the rail industry in general, and a lot of liquidated lines. But more recently, I don't, maybe a lot of them are already, have been retired or abandoned. So
you're probably right. It's nothing recent. I mean, it probably was 70s and 80s, I would guess. But that's why it just surprised me.
Jump in here for a second, Director. Until the mid-80s, let me back up. The railroads, when they started in the 1830s and as they grew over time and through the Civil War, et cetera, were the Facebook and Google of industry 150 plus years ago. And they had very bad relations, and still do, frankly, have pretty bad relations with the major railroads, with their own employees. And what happened, and their precedents were set, and court cases were resulted, and the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is the predecessor to the Surface Transportation Board, which is a federal regulatory authority, they made it very difficult for railroads to abandon, but nonetheless, railroads did abandon and then ultimately liquidate many. I think we had 180,000 miles at the peak. I think we're down somewhere to 130,000 plus or minus 10,000 miles now of track. The peak was around the Second World War. And but what's happened, particularly in the mid 80s, there was a decision that was handed down by the ICC that made it easier for short lines like the one that serves you, that operates on your track, to come in and run a less expensive operation than the bigger railroad that preceded it would have been able to run. So basically, think of it like this. Maybe you have American Airlines in the state of Washington, and there's probably an American Express subsidiary. It may have another name, but American Eagle, I think, was a name at one point. So in that same kind of relationship, big company and smaller relative, they may not be owned by the same enterprise, but they coordinate with each other. That's pretty much what the situation now is in the railroad industry. There have been literally more than 100 short line railroads created in the last 35 years. And they are largely the bread and butter. But so I think if the abandonments that, I'm not saying that the liquidation doesn't happen often. I'm sure there are many lines that are abandoned every year, but they have to go through a process through a federal regulatory agency. And I think Gary is right in that between the public sector and the rules that the Surface Transportation Board is obliged to follow, there is a pro-conservation element. But I don't think we need to focus, I don't think it's helpful to focus on what happened in the past. We really should be focusing on this line and the pros and cons of keeping it in the current institutional situation or going through a transaction.
Thank you.
I got one question on, and I don't might not been in the scope of work of the feasibility of what the value of the current condition of the track is. And that value of whether or not it's feasible for the current load that it has or future load and what that would take to up those roads. So the question is, was that included in this? It's taking a high level look at the condition of the track as it is right now.
I'll answer that, Keith, if it's okay with you.
Yeah.
So the condition, the physical inspection, which Mr. Bruno referred to on the second or third slide, was conducted by a person who I really believe is one of the best inspectors in the country. He happened to rise to a very high level at a major railroad. He had thousands of people reporting to him, but he was at the very, very top of the maintenance of the infrastructure maintenance department at CSX. It doesn't matter, it's an Eastern Railroad, the skill set is the same. So in order to calculate any of the track values, either the track removed number that you're seeing on the first line or the track in place, this on the second line, they're basically three components. The first, sir, is the inventory of what's out there. How many miles of this type of track are there? How many miles of this weight of track? How many miles of this weight of track? How many anchors? How many spikes? Blah, blah, blah. Inventory. Okay. So we develops an inventory. The second thing is a condition assessment. And that gets to your point, because not all, if the operator is operating on track that's 100 pounds, some of that 100-pound rail sells at one price, some of it may sell at a second price, some of it may sell at a third. and Mr. Bagley, who did the inspection, he stratified the asset, rail or other other track material, et cetera, by condition. So the short answer to your question is yes. And the third phase is, well, how much is that track per mile, per unit in that condition? What is its value? And it's a big calculation. A lot of numbers added together. We use a computer model to help us keep track of everything. So he did keep condition in mind. But what we normally do when we do a condition assessment is also estimate how much it would cost to keep it operating at its current state, 10 miles an hour, if that's the current state, or to fix it to 20 miles an hour. We call that cost to cure, cost, TO cure. But that was not part of our scope. He did keep enough notes so that we could do it, but your director wanted to keep things inexpensive to begin with. We're happy to do it, but we have not done it because it wasn't part of our scope. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yeah, that second portion of it was what I was kind of looking at, and I didn't remember if it was in the scope or not, and so thank you, appreciate the clarification.
Well, and Commissioner Watts, if you may not remember this, but we did have an engineering firm give us that laundry list of how much it would cost to take it up to, I don't remember the weight, but to take it like 200, what is the 230 pound? Is that the really?
268 or 280 is the new state.
I think it was 268 to take it up to that, which would be like a spectacular, the best we could ever hope for. So I do have those numbers.
Yeah, and so a combination of those, combination of what we have here.
Yeah.
Like you said, gathering all the
Yeah.
information, going, what are we working with here? Where do we want to go? Appreciate it, thank you.
I have a couple questions. How do we cure the access the main line to get our grain to the main line down at Fort Wallula? Do you have any clue how that's being directed?
If you're talking about getting over Union Pacific to get to a
Yes.
particular place,
Yes.
Yeah,
there has only been one condemnation of active track. That is, by active, I mean someone is using it. There's only been one condemnation of active track in the United States in the last 100 years, and probably ever. And I happened to be the witness on that case. It went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And the gentleman who today is the chairman of Chief Justice, Mr. Roberts, was actually on our side, thank God, but of the case. But the railroad industry hates the idea. The term of art, sir, is open access, essentially allowing Railroad A to operate over Railroad B. That kind of access does exist in the United States, but it only exists in two circumstances that do not apply here. I'll go through it briefly, and if you want to ask a follow-up, help yourself. First, when a railroad acquires another railroad or merges with it, sometimes the regulatory agency, currently the Surface Transportation Board, conditions the acceptance of the merger or acquisition on allowing a competitor to operate over a railroad line. So it's a condition as part of the granting of support by the regulatory agency. That's situation one. That doesn't really apply here. Situation two is, let's say the Burlington Northern wants to operate over the Union Pacific in the state of Washington. Somewhere else, the Union Pacific wants to operate over the Burlington Northern, say the state of California. They work out a trade amongst themselves. So I don't believe the track over which your operator operates is attractive enough to Union Pacific for him to work a trade, or presumably he would have worked a trade. But my point is, in the United States, people always complain that our passenger rail service is so lousy in the United States. One of the reasons it's lousy is because the freight railroads own their tracks. The laws of the United States do not permit a railroad to operate over the owner's tracks without the owner's permission.
Well, this is just an odd situation because UP owned this short line that we're referring to. And it's UP's line that we need to cross to reach a grain elevator, and the operator before this one had access, so I don't know. I don't know why
Is
we
it to
can't.
cross it or is it to use it? Excuse me, I'm ignorant on the situation. Is it just to cross it?
1
or-
mile of, I think it's 1 mile of use. Paul's on here, he could answer it. I think it's 1 mile on UP's line.
Yeah, that's correct, Jenny.
So
Yeah.
I don't, I think the operator is in as good position to answer this as I am. If you wanted to try to get across it, you could seek to cross it, but it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in consulting and legal fees to do so. We had a client that was in the Carolinas that, a cement company that wanted to get to Railroad B and currently was captive to Railroad A. And the Surface Transportation Board ultimately turned it down. The Surface Transportation Board, when it's run by one party, tends to look more favorably than the other, but generally speaking, the regulators really don't want to get in there and start changing the status quo. So I'm afraid the odds are stacked against you. The operators welcome to join in on this conversation if Paul chooses to do so. But the odds are stacked against allowing railroads to cross each other unless the owner can be persuaded to do so.
Thank you.
And maybe Paul can add a little more. Could you just hand the cars off to them and them take them the 1 mile farther?
So if a class 1 or major US railroad touches a car for, 100 feet, they generally want $1,000 for the honor of doing so. And so, you can truck barge wheat pretty competitively to Portland, from the Dayton area. Rail barge would be great, and we've hardly given up on that. But it's a complex situation. Union Pacific is literally our landlord for 50 miles, and those miles are critical to getting there. So hardball's not really on the table. Suing the UP, is probably similar to suing the federal government. So expensive and probably, low success factor. So that's just a couple comments on that.
There is an initiative that the Surface Transportation Board is considering that would allow the operator to operate that 1 mile over Union Pacific, but whether it would have succeeded had the previous chairman of the Surface Transportation Board, which at the time had 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, if that party had stayed in power, and if that particular individual who was very pro-shipper had stayed in power, perhaps that the current situation could be remedied. But I don't think it's likely to happen with the new administration coming in, because the Republicans so far have voted. There are always two Democrats, always 2 Republicans, and then the chairman is generally in the same party as the president of the United States. And the Republicans so far have been allied with the major railroads in their votes. So my assumption is that in 2025, there will not be enough votes. The initiative is called Ex parte 7. Let me provide the number to the director. I think it's 711, but ex parte just means it's a initiative underway. We've actually been involved in that as well because I think it would help the railroad industry thrive. But the problem is that the 6 major railroads in the United States and Canada, they don't want to change in the status quo. They extract a tremendous amount of money through their operating leverage, and they're happy to have your operator and 600 other small ones do all the hard work and just get the scraps in terms of revenue.
Thank you.
I got one more quick question for Paul, if that's all right. Real quickly, Paul, if you could kind of give me a reminder or with the audience of the condition of the track and what's limiting us or limiting the port and yourself as a partner of the viability of more traffic, more revenue. I know it's a couple things we talked about is access down at Port Wallula, the condition of the track itself, the miles per hour. Can you remind me real again what that, just a quick synopsis of what the condition and what's limiting us to do more at its current state?
Right. So, this track was originally put down in, call it, the 1880s, and maybe last upgraded in the early 1900s, maybe 1920s or so. And so it's predominantly 1898 or 1908 rail. So it's safely operable at low speeds, but it's quite antiquated and expensive to maintain. We're not moving a lot of tonnage on it, maybe 200 some cars a year in total, and about a third of that, 40% of that coming out of Dayton, and the balance out of Prescott, plus a little bit of storage traffic. So, and then, the roadbed is, heavily cinder ballast because the steam engines used to make a lot of cinders and they could just get rid of them on the track. And, when the freight cars were 50 or 70 tons, that was manageable. They also had, kind of gangs of men to go tinker on the track, and labor costs were cheap. So now that the freight cars weigh about twice, 3 times that, it's sort of manageable because we're not moving a lot on it. Now, we're not leaving any freight on the table. I've got 250 miles that we manage around the state, and about 100 of those we put back into service after having been closed and overgrown for 20 years or more in cases. So I'm getting a little bit beyond your question, but it needs a lot of updates, and there's a lot of capital needs essentially looming. So it's serviceable on the one hand, but it's expensive to maintain. And getting back to the original genesis of this business, we had communicated that we were needing to get into an ownership pattern to continue shouldering the ongoing TLC and updates.
Thank you.
Yep.
A little different subject. Was it determined, or maybe not part of your investigation, whether or not the port owns the right of way in fee simple, or was there any grant lands involved or anything like that?
Mr. Engelmeyer assumed, and I'm sure he said in his appraisal, because I've seen 50 of his appraisals before, but he'll confirm or not confirm if I'm wrong, that he assumed it was all held in fee simple, but we did not do any title work. Is that correct, Gary?
Yes, we didn't receive title work, and it did assume fee simple. I think there was, Jenny mentioned there was some title work done on a part of it that they were considering for the trail, and
9 miles.
yeah, and that most of that was, I think, fee simple, as she said, but the rest of it is unknown. And that's another one of those big difference between a net liquidation value and a quarter value, because the if it's a net liquidation value and it's a reversionary interest or an easement, it's extinguished, or you get zero credit for that in the net liquidation value. Whereas in a corridor value, the operator is going to want to operate the corridor perpetuity or some long period of time, and it's having those operating rights are more important. It's the title. Most railroad property has a substantial amount of title issues, and when they sell, it's with a quitclaim deed. Is what we have is what you get. But as long as an operator can get from the real estate valuation perspective, from A to B, and they have those rights, it's almost tantamount into perpetuity. It's almost tantamount to a fee simple interest. The property rights get involved when you really start selling off the land, and then that's when you really take a hit on it.
So to answer your question, at least on that 9 miles, the investigation they did for the trail is there were no reversionary interest in the deeds. They did a title search, and I have copies of them, and there were no reversion, which was amazing. Because in some cases, that's the way it has been, but there were none in that 9 miles. So
Usually out west, it's about 85%. I've just a ballpark average I've experienced this fee. Feasible, but that's just a ballpark. But I don't know exactly how much was or wasn't, but the corridor value would reflect the right to operate on there into perpetuity, tantamount to fee. So easements would be extinguished too. Not just reversionary rights, or just if the rail line goes away, then so do those rights, but they go back to the property owner. But anyway.
Any other questions?
Anybody else have a question?
yes.
So the appraisal being as is where is, and Jenny had talked about an improvement over a crossing. What percentage of the amount spent would then add to the value of the rail line?
Are you talking about of that specific project, sir?
Yeah, as a crossing, and was it 1 point?
It was a 1.69 million for a crossing and the crossing equipment repair on a highway, the actual crossing and the equipment.
So at a $1.69 million improvement like that, what would then be added to the value of the rail line?
Well, our firm is not familiar with the specifics of that project. But let me ask the director, is rail to be replaced? Are new ties to be put in? Or is it just the highway side that's getting the improvements?
Just the highway, the concrete highway improvement, but there will be new rail.
Then I believe our answer would be, tentatively, would be no increase in the value based on that crossing improvement. If you're not improving the ties and you're not changing the actual rail infrastructure, then there should be no change due to the fact that no matter how much you invest or little you invest in that particular crossing project, it won't affect any of these numbers on this page.
So the grant that we have to do tie repair from Dayton to Waitsburg, that could improve.
That would.
could-
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
All right.
it would.
Okay.
You have to look at the specifics of exactly what went into, because that, any figure, any project dollar amount, a lot of it is labor putting the stuff in. And the only thing that really affects any of the numbers that we've put in is the material. What we're valuing here is the material. The only impact of labor on these 4 numbers is a subtraction, because it costs money to remove the track, because you need labor and machinery to remove the track. Hope I haven't confused you with that last comment.
Any questions? So this has to do with the real estate side of it on your valuations. So we go through 2 different counties. there is a certain zoning in Columbia County and a different zoning in probably Walla Walla County, meaning more ag. So was that taken in consideration as far as values for the property?
That's a Gary question.
Oh, I'm sorry, what was it again? Could you repeat the
So,
question?
yeah, so was zoning taken in consideration in valuing the real estate? As in Columbia County has a different zoning than what Walla Walla County would have, and these go through two different counties. And someone had mentioned industrial as a potential, I guess you were talking about that as a potential use for some of the, if it was for the rail line property. So did you have two different values between Columbia County zoning property and Walla Walla County?
We definitely take the zoning into consideration. It's always the most, restrictive, parameter of use, of the property. The difference, there were different value, cross fence values assigned to the industrial land in Walla Walla versus Dayton and the other smaller towns up to the north. The data, the sale data suggested it decreased as you got further away from more of the major that Tri-County metropolitan area. So it was, but it was the difference wasn't because of the zoning. It was more just market trends.
He did the specific properties in the appraisal. Yeah.
Mhm.
I have a question for Paul, if I may.
Go ahead.
Paul, several times in the past, you have discussed that you would like to, you didn't want to fix up the rails if you were just leasing them. However, one of the reasons why you wanted the rails and why you wanted to fix them up is because you had implied that you would like to start running dinner trains and event trains on the rail, and that you already had those special cars available further south. Would that still be part of your intent?
I don't necessarily have a fleet of cars at this time, but my ultimate vision for the Walla Walla Dayton area would be that we would have equipment available for charters, dining or event charters, maybe community event type excursions. I don't think the market is there necessarily for routine service, but we'd like to get the track up to a state that it was legal to handle that. I mean, our first stretch that we would like to get that covered on is Dayton to Waitsburg.
Have you run a passenger train somewhere else?
I mean, we're not necessarily in that business yet. I mean, from time to time, we've run a, like a friends and family trip or a, not quite a political junket, but that kind of thing for electeds and or shippers. So I don't know if that answers your question. No regular excursions at this point.
Yeah, I was really asking about a real public tourism train.
No, like I say, I think our focus would be infrequent, seasonal, community event, charters. That's its own skill set, and it takes some real investment, and we're primarily a freight outfit. But I do think, especially with the proximity to Walla Walla and the value of the tourism business there, I think there's some strong potential for us to ultimately invest in some staff bandwidth and skill set there.
Jacob's got a question.
You were saying, Jenny, earlier, you do have a grant for tie work between Waitsburg and Dayton.
Yep.
How much is that grant?
I don't remember. Paul, what is the grant from the Freight Rail Bank?
It's in the high 500s, and our match on that is 174, and I think the port's match of the 174 was 20.
How many ties, or how much percentage of the ties will it replace? I guess better.
So I think don't quote me on this, but I want to say it was a little over 3,000 ties, And basically a tired old tie that's maybe 60 some years old, they actually do a pretty good job of holding the weight up. They don't do a great job of holding the rails at the proper gauge. And so when you're in that state and you need to get good gauge retention, it's about every third or fourth tie that you end up having to do. And if you sprinkle them any thinner than that, they just really take a beating.
So you're saying about 1/3 of the ties were replaced with this grant then?
I'd have to do the math, but our track roadmaster, he actually walked all 10 miles and spotted them in certain places. So it wasn't just a general, every
Yeah, I
fourth
understand that.
tie. We actually targeted them. That's out to bid right now. Depending on how the bids come back, we'll either do it with our forces or contract that out. But I think our match was about 25%. And just real quick on the grants, if I can, this last round of Washington State grants, we applied for one to build 2,000 feet of track at Wallula to support our exchange of cars with the UP and the BNSF, and that grant was not approved by the state. And I think there was 5 grants that were approved, and every single one of them was 50% or more match. And so the grants are free money on the one hand, but at least with regards to the state grant system, you got to have a lot of your own money as well under the current format. And then they recently communicated to us that due to the apparent need for belt tightening in the Olympia budget, that those funds are likely to be frozen. So I'm not sure if that applies to our current grant or just the round that we just applied for. But those are two factors that are out there on the grant scene.
So you applied for money to put on that line that you don't own, correct?
Down at Wallula?
Yeah, because that's the part you don't own, right?
Yeah, we have, we don't own any of the tracks in Walla Walla or Columbia County right now. So that particular track is jointly owned between BNSF and UP. And we currently have a fresh 10-year lease renewal on that. And, it's also, the rail between Wallula and Walla Walla is much more substantial and up to date.
More questions?
Anybody else?
Just a general comment. To me, we certainly should continue to try to increase profits from the railroad and more business, add more business. But the real value I see is that 30-mile corridor we have. If in fact the tribes prevail and the dams go out, that value, there'll be a lot of, there's no doubt in my mind, if that were to happen, there'd be a lot of mitigating funds come down, probably to rebuild the railroad, whatever it would take. Now, that's my opinion, having observed for many years. But I do think there's a good possibility that the tribe will prevail. They have in many cases. And anyway, that corridor is the value.
Okay, any other questions?
Thank you all.
Jenny,
Appreciate your time.
would you be able to say one more thing?
Yeah.
Okay, so I live up in Lewiston, Idaho now, and if any of you have opportunity to travel up the Clearwater, you can observe that there's in different places stashed about 30 miles of long-term stored rail cars. And without throwing a whole lot of shade on my own storage of cars, it's kind of unsightly, and to the extent that it inhibits the ability of producers and receivers, rail shippers in those communities from being able to use the rail network, it's not the most, community oriented. So in terms of concepts to, plug the Dayton line full of storage cars, we could do that, but we've never wanted to. We've wanted it operating up to Seneca, which is what we got it doing, I think, in 2017. And, that's leaving money on the table versus just plugging it full of storage. But we never envisioned that would be what the community or the port wanted with the rail line. I do have one line south of Milton Freewater, Oregon, where we have about 5 miles of cars stuffed up that valley, and we get nothing but complaints from that. And our situation is that the customer that's located up that valley was ordering 1 to 3 cars, and we'd have situations where the 3 cars would show up 1 a week early, 1 on time, and 1 a week late, or we wouldn't get cars at all. And the arrangement we made with them was that if they were willing to, pay for the tie upgrades that we were going to need to keep that line operational, we'd keep it operational, and they elected to start transloading the freight in Milton Freewater instead. So we've got the cars up that valley to help us, prosper and keep the doors open. And eventually we want to get that line operational again. But, on my 250 miles, again, 100 miles, which we put back in service from not being used at all, stuffing a county full of rail cars is about the last thing, like I say, we would anticipate that the community would appreciate. And I do appreciate Seneca's business and comments tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I appreciate your time, everybody. Appreciate all the comments and questions.
Thank you, RL Banks and Gary, very much for your
Yes.
time and for staying with us until 10 o'clock East Coast time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Appreciate that.
Insightful.
And
Appreciate it.
your effort to try to keep our costs down. I know that they went significantly over budget to prepare this for us, so thank you for that.
Thank you much. Appreciate your time.
That, our
All right.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Keith, you want to stop sharing your screen? Great, thank you.
Okay. We'll go ahead and move on in our agenda to Blue Mountain Station.
So Jenny, it's okay if we drop off, right?
Yes, thank you. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Yeah.
All right. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas.
Okay, so we'll just, because this is going so late, I think we'll, quickly move on to, the letter for the malt equipment, funding. Phil is here. There's Phil. Poor Phil's been in the other room. Thank you, Phil, for being in the Zoom room.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so, what this is about is that, we have, budgeted, part of the curb funding that we got is budgeted for a certain piece of the malting equipment that is integral to the building. The rest of it Phil is gonna buy on his own. This is equipment that he has gotten at a discounted price. It is used, it is sitting at the facility. But the seller wants to sell it ASAP. Although, did you ever hear from them about whether or not you could get into 2025 a little bit?
I mean, we're gonna have to at this point.
Okay,
It's just what the,
Okay.
what other,
Right.
we may have to deal with.
Yeah, and then the other, the other part, Phil's part is that he got a grant to help pay for part of it. And it's a USDA grant and he doesn't have, that kind of money sitting around to pay for it and then wait to get reimbursed from the grant. Which is also, honestly, this would be helpful to us as well. So, Phil is working on a bridge loan from Steward, which is the company, I think Dan was on one of the calls early on when we were talking about applying for funds. And that bridge loan then would pay for the equipment, and then this letter is to assure the funder that we have the $600,000 from the curb funds that would repay our portion of it. And we would hold title to the equipment. If we're gonna pay for any of it, we're gonna hold title.
Right.
So that's what we're doing with this letter, and I'm still not sure about timing of when this will happen, but that's what the letter that I put in your packet is all about, and I asked Phil to come tonight in case you had questions for him, and I put your names on the letter because it holds a lot more water with the lender than just my name.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think it looks great.
Yeah, I read it earlier and, that sounds appropriate.
Okay,
Do we need a motion or anything, Jenny?
well, you're all three signing it, but it wouldn't, I suppose it wouldn't hurt. Usually when you sign things, we don't do motions.
I think we can just sign it.
I think you can probably just sign it, yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else going on Blue Mountain Station?
Well, I don't know if we have anything else to report. We, did not get the grant for the equipment we were trying to get for the pasta company, but they still want to come. They just have to figure out how to make the relocation. And, Jill got, word today of some, potential drain cleaning equipment, Phil, that is, available. Did you ever get to talk to him?
No,
No.
because I was married.
It's available, at a very low price. So we are gonna see what that price is and see, because we need, drain cleaning and conveyance equipment. That's part of the project. So, working on that. I don't think there's anything else, of interest down there.
About Rock Hill Industrial Park.
We did part of the road grading. Oh, Pat's gone. Part of the road grading that his company is doing for us has been completed, but not all of it. Yeah. We did have a little, issue with there's one sewer pump in this industrial park, and that is at Dayton Tractor and Machine. They are lower and they have to pump the sewage up to the city line. So we had a difficulty with that pump and there is a plumber in town now, Apex Plumbing. Did y'all know that? There's a local plumber. And did you ever hear back on how it's done? Yeah, it was great. So we called him and he was able to come right away. So his name is Chance Johnson. Is that right? Yeah. So that's exciting to have somebody local besides Dale, because Dale doesn't like PVC. And you probably know that if you've called Dale. And otherwise, I think the industrial park is good. We have the trays ready for our tenants. They're all the trays we give out every year. They're in the office. We'll start handing them out tomorrow and the next day.
Very nice.
So for those of you that don't know, we give each of our tenants a gift at the end of the year, just a goodie tray. We all three bake and big goodies. And then this year we're giving them a bottle of Red Van Cellars wine. Sometimes we do coffee from the Mountain Station or whatever products we pay for them from our, yes, we buy them.
You give a discount.
Yes, we do get a discount, yeah. Next year, I think we're gonna, the new cider company at Blue Mountain Station, they've got cider ready. They're ready to start selling it in the market, so hopefully next year we can do the cider. That'll be a new one. Sorry, Dave.
Everybody's gotta have their chance.
Yeah. So I think that's it down there.
All right. And Lions Ferry Marina.
We are working on the annual management planning documents we have to do every year. One is due January 1st. I've met with the new concessionaires. We're going through the list of improvements they'd like to make for the year and maintenance. And then, I've talked to them about the RV pull-throughs, and we met right before they were headed to the KOA convention. That's kind of a big deal for all the KOA owners. And they're trying to figure out how they could maybe try to do it themselves if they can. So we have not met yet since they got back, but if they could find a way to borrow the money and do it themselves, they're gonna see what they can figure out while we wait to find out what's gonna happen with we probably know at the time of the during the legislative session, that's when that funding is actually allocated.
Right.
So that's when we would find out whether they got extra funding and our project was funded, or if any projects dropped out. So if we don't end up getting the money, they're gonna try to figure out if they can do it, so.
How
That's
expensive is
good
that,
news.
Cindy?
$1.8 million.
Is it cheaper if they do it themselves?
Yes,
Yes.
much.
Yeah, I was just,
I told them that, yeah.
because I know government work
Yeah.
can be expensive.
Yes, it can, yeah. We already had a lot of in-kind match as part of this project. That new concessionaire has a lot of contacts in the construction world. And so we already were really stretching the government dollars a very good amount, so. And the port we had pledged to put in some funds, so. But yes, I did tell him it would be much less expensive if he did it.
That's what I figured.
And he seems to have friends that would be willing to help him, so.
Yeah, and I think there's somebody that hit it on earlier about the shortfall. It's $10 to $12 billion shortfall. Projected.
Yeah,
Still early, but that
yeah.
is big numbers.
For the state of Washington.
State of Washington.
Yeah, they teased us, as Jill will tell you, they teased us with we're gonna increase your ADO funding for next year, and now that's,
Yeah, there's a lot of things on.
yeah, well,
Those are right
we're
now.
hoping they don't reduce it, but they
Yeah.
may, yeah. Yep, so that's all that I've got for the marina.
Alrighty, let's go on to broadband.
We finally got the retainage paid for 0DB. I think we told you that last meeting, and still waiting on the state for the retainage for the second project. Still continue to add customers to the list. We just really haven't had any losses. Even though Spectrum is hitting the community hard. And then the rural broadband planning, the Port of Whitman is having us prepare just in case we do apply for BEAD funding. It is very complicated, as I've mentioned before, but they want us to be ready just in case they can negotiate a deal with the feds. So Tracy and Jill worked on some of the paperwork while I was on vacation. There are going to be probably 2 new policies, I would say, at our January meeting that we will need to pass in order to meet the federal requirements. So some of their bureaucracy, red tape. That's it.
Okay. So community and economic development, starting with staff reports.
Well, the only thing I'm going to report on is my pride and joy, which is the federal audit. I'm very happy about it and want to share it publicly. We had our exit conference today, and they, in their very nice words, their words are not nice, they're just so vague, but they reported no deficiencies in the design or operation of internal control over financial reporting. We identified no deficiencies that we considered to be material weaknesses. We reported no deficiencies in the design or operation of internal control over federal programs. No deficiencies in what we consider material weaknesses. So basically, we got a clean audit in every area, financial and federal. So I am very proud, since that was my first federal audit.
Good job.
Nice work.
Yes,
Nice work.
thank you. And they gave us a ginormous report and a few little things to improve our annual financial statement. Just a couple of very small tweaks on things we're supposed to be reporting on, so.
Excellent.
Good job.
Yeah, thank
That
you.
goes to all of you.
Yeah.
It takes a village.
It does, yes.
It does.
I don't know if Jill gets very much credit, but Tracy does. Tracy definitely does.
Well, you can write the coattails.
Yeah, Tracy's
She's the back.
keeper of the spreadsheets. Yeah. Other than that, I will let Jill talk about the SEDS meeting. We had a great SEDS meeting, so I'll let her report on that.
Sure, yeah, so we had our SEDS meeting, we had a record turnout, 63 people. We decided this year to host it, in the pavilion instead of the youth building. And that worked out pretty well. We have some things we're gonna tweak to kind of set up that space better, but it was really nice. We had Dina from the county present on housing. And then, Diane McKinley with the Parks and Rec District presented on the pool project. And then Phil was our guest speaker, talking about the craft malt facility and kind of the green cluster. And then you do have the list of the voted on projects. So tallied those from all the attendees, obviously get to rank their votes 1, 2, and 3 priorities. And those top 3 that came out are the pool, housing, and walk-through fitness. So yeah, it was a really good meeting and super insightful presentations from everyone. We had the Q cater the lunch and it was super great. Other than that, don't have much, just had guys' night out last night. And it went pretty well. It was fun, so, yeah. That's
I
pretty
think
much all I got.
Mike, I've heard that Mike actually went. and shot.
Mike
did.
did
Thank
go,
you,
Mike.
I saw
got
Jelly.
out at night.
I wanted to say, great job on the SEDS meeting
Thank you.
and good location. It wasn't so crowded as it was over in the youth building and made it easier to,
Yeah, it
Yeah.
seemed to work out. The
Yeah.
technology
The
worked really well
technology
too,
was way
because
easier.
sometimes in that pavilion in the past, the technology has been difficult, but
Yeah.
it worked well. The Wi-Fi, they've got,
Yeah.
as they should, since they have our fiber.
yeah.
Oh, you know what? That is one thing I forgot to say. The county has asked for, when in my broadband report, they have asked for some dark fibers to, connect that new building that they purchased, the, REA building.
Mhm.
So we are working with them to,
Is that kind of like the dark web or?
it's what we put in as dark fiber.
Oh, okay.
The ISPs light it, we put in dark,
Oh, okay.
but we are going to contract with 0DB and have them put that in, and then the county will pay us for it, 100%. Won't cost us anything. But, we'll take care of the work for them, and we'll own the fiber, then they'll just use it. So, yeah,
Is that to the fire station building or?
no, they bought the old Columbia Pulp office
Oh,
on the
yeah.
corner
Yeah.
of Front and Main.
That building, okay.
And so they need everything to be connected, and they'll run fibers between buildings and then also back to our co-location center here. They put in $90,000 in match for the project,
Okay.
so they are the only entity that gets to have equipment in our co-location room without paying us rent. So we have an interlocal agreement. So they'll use that equipment as the brains of the system, and really helpful to them to have the fiber network.
Mhm.
All right. Anything else, Jill? Okay. Commissioner Spring, that brings it up to you for the task force.
I attended it and forgot my notes, but.
The task force meeting this month was.
The SEDS, yeah.
Oh, was it? the set?
Remember? Yeah.
No, I don't remember.
Oh, yeah.
It was a great meeting. And the men's night out needs some men to show up. I was walking up and down Main Street kind of by myself.
Yeah.
There were
No.
more women out than men on men's night, so we need some participation.
We don't know if what do the men here think of that?
It
You think
needed
it's a good
I
idea?
think you need a little more promotion. I didn't learn about it till the SEDS meeting and I had a meeting that night.
Okay,
And so I wasn't able to attend.
but you would have maybe,
I would have,
Yeah.
yes, but I had a meeting and I wasn't notified and
Okay.
then I totally. Got to a meeting and not knowing about it exactly. I thought it was tonight, actually,
okay.
so.
Anybody else have any?
I made it.
Did you go? Okay,
Yeah,
I
saw
didn't
that.
see you on the street.
Dave,
You did it.
I had my Christmas shopping done already.
okay.
I just got started last night.
Not done yet.
Yeah,
I'll be
maybe
done
we
till
should
the
post it on Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
Stop me.
That would don't smell.
At noon.
Honestly, when it's a little closer, Christmas 20th might not be a horrible idea.
No, it's not. That's
Honestly.
actually
That's what Guy thinks.
the original one that we had years and years ago, I think was like on the 23rd or something. It was
Oh,
like.
wow.
Honestly,
right
it wouldn't be a
before
bad
Christmas.
idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The closer to Christmas, it's the one time guys want to shop or, yes, they
I
want to
finally
shop, but need to
actually
shop.
find out what my wife wants by the 23rd, so. I am.
Okay, that brings us to the end. Let's go ahead and have our final public comment period. Go
I
ahead.
do have one comment. Dave Harvey, 816 East Clay Street. I lease 3, 4, 5 in Blue Mountain up here at the Rock. We call this area
Rock
here,
Hill Industrial
Rock Hill
Park.
Industrial Park and Unit J down at Blue Mountain Station. Recently I was looking at the river on GIS to figure out who owned what pieces of property adjacent to the river so I could talk to them about fishing on that. And I stumbled across something as I was doing that. I don't mean to imply any impropriety, but Commissioner Watts owns property adjacent to the railroad right away. And in my mind, and also I was doing this with my fishing buddy, who is a lawyer, we both thought, this is a conflict of interest.
And that no matter how you vote, for or against, you open the port to substantial lawsuits. And unfortunately, who pays for those lawsuits? The tenants. So I would ask that you consider abstaining from voting on the railroad matter. Again, I don't mean that you've acted in any impropriety, with any impropriety. It's just the fact that you do own property that is adjacent to the railroad and that the value of that property is affected by who owns it. Thank you.
Yeah, I would look at legal or anything before any of that, so that's part of the process, so.
Yeah.
I do it, so.
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you though.
Anybody else?
Melissa Bryan, Baileysburg. So I would just like to request, if we could, you guys have a discussion maybe about a much larger screen. We can't see anything, and there are much larger screens that are really not that expensive. And that would be amazing for those of us in the audience.
It helped me too. I checked by it, it's by a bigger
Projector might
TV.
actually be better.
Well, and I was trying to figure out as we were talking, if we could reconfigure the room, like would it be
Please.
better to have the TV back here? And our backs to it where you guys can see it and the commissioners can
But
see
then
it?
we can't see it.
But we can
We
see
could watch your
yours.
computer.
I mean, you
Yeah.
can see it. I don't know that I need to
I
see it.
can't see it.
Turn the U around and put the
No,
TV in a
it's-
cabinet.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, could we keep the TV and add a big screen there and then
That's a
put
good
the
idea.
other one back here, that one that we currently own?
Yeah,
I mean,
possibly.
could
Oh,
have
they
two,
Or just a second.
Yeah.
Just a second
Move this-
screen would be
Move this
hard.
one here and the bigger one there. I
yeah.
don't know.
Or
We will look
projector.
into it. I think that's a fine idea.
I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody on Zoom with public comment? Anybody still on Zoom? Okay, hearing nothing. Time is 7:07. This meeting's adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Don't be stepping on my head.
No, heaven forbid.